One of the greatest games ever made taught Nintendo the lesson that doomed the N64.
It's me, Mario!
Before you even start playing Mario 64, Nintendo lets you grab Mario by the face. You can stretch his nose, pull his ears, twist his head around until he looks completely deranged. All before you've even pressed the start button to actually play the game. Nintendo was just showing off what the N64 could do. Then you take control, and Mario moves like no character before him. Tilt the stick, and he tiptoes. Push farther, and he runs. Before you've entered a single level, you're already chaining long jumps across the lawn and diving into the moat. Moving Mario was already fun enough to be the entire game. But Mario 64 was so extraordinary, Nintendo began to believe that the next masterpiece could make everything else around it irrelevant. So Nintendo built monuments, and Sony built a city.
For a 360-degree burn!
Nintendo's belief that everyone else would simply fall in line had been decades in the making. For most of the 1980s, Nintendo practically owned the console industry. By the early 90s, Sega had finally started fighting back, but Nintendo was still used to being the boss man. Nintendo decided how many games you could release, what they could contain, and how much you were gonna pay for the privilege. Simply put, they were your daddy. And like a good son, developers agreed. There was just nowhere else worth being. When Mortal Kombat came to the SNES, Nintendo scrubbed the blood clean and toned down the violence to protect its family image. The uncensored version went to the Sega Genesis, and players, the ones Nintendo was supposedly protecting, bought the Genesis version instead. Genesis does what Nintendo don't, am I right?
What Nintendo?
Now, this should have been an epiphany for Nintendo. When Nintendo overrode what players actually wanted, gamers didn't tolerate it. They just went somewhere else instead. But Nintendo never learned. It kept mistaking control for strength, even after players had shown how quickly they would leave. And Nintendo had already made an even bigger version of that mistake 2 years earlier. It was building the machine that would define the next generation, a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. And you'd never guess who its partner was. Sony. Yeah, that Sony. The two companies had been working together in secret since the late 80s. Sony was meant to handle the CD hardware, and they already had a prototype. Its name, the PlayStation. Yeah, I'm gonna let that sink in. Imagine a version of history where the PlayStation was a Nintendo product. But Nintendo read the fine print of the contract between them, and they didn't like what they saw. The deal gave Sony control of the CD licensing. We're talking royalties, developer relationships, the whole shebang. And if there's one thing Nintendo couldn't stand, it was somebody else deciding who got to make games on a Nintendo machine. So at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1991, Sony proudly announced the partnership. And almost immediately afterward, Nintendo walked on stage and broke up with them in front of the entire industry. Yeesh. I thought my breakups were bad. Nintendo Philips' deal is a slap at Sony, read the front page of the New York Times. It's still called one of the greatest betrayals the industry has ever seen. Sony's leadership had been humiliated in public, and Ken Kutaragi, one of Sony's lead engineers, convinced them they'd be better off building a console of their own. So, Nintendo walked away from Sony to protect its future, and ironically handed Sony one of its own. Kutaragi's team started over with a standalone 32-bit console built around CDs and 3D graphics, and designed to make life easier for outside developers. It was called the PlayStation. Meanwhile, Nintendo's shiny new Philips partnership never produced the CD add-on at all. All it really gave us were those deeply cursed Mario and Zelda CDI games.
Nice of the princess to invite us over for a picnic, eh, Luigi? I hope she made lots of spaghetti.
When the PlayStation launched in 1994, it gave developers almost everything Nintendo's next console wouldn't. Discs held more data and cost less to manufacture. Sony gave studios tools that made games easier to build, and instead of treating publishers like subjects, it treated them like partners. Developers finally had somewhere else worth being. By the time the Nintendo 64 finally showed up in 1996, Nintendo was already at a huge disadvantage. Not only were they late, but they were still using cartridges at the exact moment everyone else had moved on to discs. Most of the industry had already picked Sony, but Nintendo still had a chance to make that choice look wrong.
It's me, Mario!
Yo, listen up.
We will not live in a two-dimensional world.
We won't go in one direction or zig where we can zag.
Game is going to be this holiday season. It's the new Nintendo 64. So what's the big deal, and why is Toys R Us already sold out?
We will change the system.
Nintendo's answer was to double down on the very strategy the industry was abandoning. Cartridges loaded instantly, and they were nearly impossible to pirate. And because Nintendo manufactured every single one, they controlled every game that shipped for the console. For the games Nintendo wanted to make, cartridges genuinely worked. The problem was Nintendo wasn't only choosing for itself. This was Mortal Kombat all over again. Developers were sick of this level of control, and now that they had somewhere else to be, they didn't have to abide by Nintendo's rules anymore. And Nintendo knew this, they just didn't think it would matter.
You got me.
They believed developers would come back once they saw what the N64 could do. But before the console even reached shelves, one of Nintendo's oldest partners refused to take that bet. Square, the studio behind Final Fantasy, a series that had lived on Nintendo hardware its entire life. Every mainline Final Fantasy up to this point had been an NES or SNES game. But the next one was gonna be different. Final Fantasy VII was gonna be huge. In fact, it was so big that trailers for this game marketed it as a friggin' movie.
The most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you. Final Fantasy VII.
The game needed far more space than a cartridge could reasonably provide. So Square went to Nintendo and told them, hey, the industry's moving to discs, man, you need to move with it. And Nintendo said no. So Square walked away and took Final Fantasy to PlayStation. Before Nintendo's console had even launched, the cartridge had already cost it one of the biggest names in gaming. When the Nintendo 64 finally showed up in North America, it launched with two games, Pilot Wing 64 and Super Mario 64. That was the entire launch lineup. By every conventional measure, Nintendo was walking into a disaster. Sony had spent the last year filling store shelves, while Nintendo was asking 2 games to compete with an entire library. Then Mario 64 made every one of those disadvantages feel irrelevant.
Most stores started selling the system today, and they've already sold out. Toys R Us had the largest shipment available to the public, and before noon, they were sold out.
Suddenly, taking 3 years to get 3D right looked like a genius move by Nintendo. The 2-game lineup didn't feel empty. One of those games felt more advanced than almost anything else you could buy. Even the cartridge started to look like a strength when Mario could dive into a painting and land in a whole other world with no loading at all. And Sony, for all the time it had ahead of Nintendo, didn't have a conclusive answer. It had already shown what 3D could do in fighting games like Tekken or the beautiful pre-rendered environments of Resident Evil, but Crash Bandicoot, Sony's closest answer to Mario, still ran down narrow tracks and corridors. Mario 64 handed you this open space, an analog stick, and a character who somehow felt natural, moving in every direction. The team was still inventing the language for movement like this. Yoshiaki Koizumi, the assistant director for Super Mario 64, remembered working with Miyamoto at 2 or 3 in the morning, trying to figure out how Mario should swim. When words weren't enough, Miyamoto threw himself across a desk and acted out the motion with his entire body. Now I can't get Miyamoto swimming like Mario out of my head. But that was the level of obsession Nintendo brought to 3D. Gamers couldn't get enough. In its first 3 months in North America, Mario 64 sold more than 2 million copies. For one launch, Nintendo's entire bet looked like a stroke of genius. Then launch day ended, and the calendar kept moving. The next major Nintendo showcase, Wave Race 64, didn't arrive until November. By the end of the year, the N64 had just 8 games in North America. For a console remembered for so many classics, its first few months were defined by silence. Then, in February of 1997, that silence finally broke.
Welcome to Mario Kart.
Mario Kart 64 arrived with the glorious split-screen multiplayer. I specifically remember playing this all huddled up with my brothers and sister on our CRT TV. That item box sound effect still ringing in my head. And I clearly wasn't the only one. Mario Kart 64 would go on to sell 9.87 million copies worldwide, making it the second best-selling game on the N64, right behind Super Mario 64. To Nintendo, that success proved Mario 64 hadn't been a fluke. The games might take months to arrive, but when they did, they could dominate everything around them. Nintendo's own chairman went on the record bragging about this. That month, Mario Kart was outselling PlayStation's biggest games 10-1. Nintendo was on top of the friggin' world. Its whole position was that Sony had nothing left. Price was the only trap card PlayStation had because it couldn't beat Nintendo on what actually mattered, the games themselves. Then, Sony played that card. It dropped the PlayStation to $150, and Nintendo matched it within weeks. Over in the UK, the reduction came so soon after launch that Nintendo mailed buyers a free copy of Mario Kart or Star Fox just to keep them from feeling robbed. Whatever Nintendo said publicly, Sony was still forcing it to move. Nintendo needed another game big enough to make all of this look irrelevant. Then GoldenEye arrived. A shooter based on a movie that was already 2 years old that had no business becoming one of the most important games of the entire generation.
GoldenEye. Load a rumble pack.
You know how to use one of these?
And see how it feels when 007 meets N64.
GameSpot gave it a 9.8 and called it the game N64 owners had been waiting for since Mario 64. The review even floated the idea that a few more games like this might give Nintendo a real shot at toppling PlayStation. The decisive feature that separated it from every other shooter at the time was 4-player split-screen multiplayer. PlayStation simply didn't have an answer for it. And what makes that even crazier is how close it came to never existing.
For people that pay attention to the industry, in Japan, a lot of people don't play with a group of people in their house. Nintendo wanted 2 controller ports, we wanted 4 controller ports. They kept telling us how much this was going to cost. We kept telling them, yeah, but Mario Kart 4-player would be really awesome.
GoldenEye was only months away from release, and it still had no multiplayer mode.
So I secretly got on with working on that without the management of Rare knowing about it.
The first 4-player version was a disaster. Everyone was bombed, the frame rate sucked, characters slid around like they were at a skating rink, and the game crashed constantly. But even in that broken state, 4 people were crowded around one screen shooting at each other, and it was fun. Within a month, Ellis had it working. Rare and Nintendo finally learned about the mode when the team put controllers in their hands and let them play it. Except Nintendo hadn't made GoldenEye, Rare had. And Sony wasn't pulling ahead on the strength of one studio. Namco had Tekken, Capcom had Resident Evil, Square was bringing Final Fantasy VII. Every one of those relationships was another reason to own a PlayStation on all the ordinary days when Nintendo had nothing new to show. And the numbers showed what all those ordinary days added up to. In December of 1996, PlayStation crossed roughly 10 million copies shipped worldwide. By August of 1997, the same month GoldenEye arrived in America, that number had doubled to 20 million. But GoldenEye would go on to outsell every individual PlayStation game in America in 1998. If Nintendo was going to keep this remotely competitive, Rare would have to do it again. And Rare did. But even Rare was starting to feel the strain. Banjo-Kazooie was supposed to be its next major release for the holidays. Then it slipped into 1998, leaving another massive hole in the N64's calendar. So Rare had no choice but to move Diddy Kong Racing up to fill the gap. Somehow, it worked out. Diddy became another hit, and Banjo followed the next summer. Nintendo's entire release calendar was now leaning on one outside studio. Those games bought Nintendo time, but the game it had been building since before launch still wasn't ready. Ocarina of Time was meant to release in 1997. Instead, the project kept growing and the release slipped almost an entire year. You can see how its ambitions kept expanding in a set of notes Koizumi had saved while finishing Mario 64. Sword fights were planned, battles against multiple enemies. These were ideas Mario 64 simply hadn't had room for. When work began on Zelda, Koizumi pulled those notes back out and started building them into the new game. Ocarina began with a team you could count on one hand. By the time it was finished, it had pulled in nearly everyone at Nintendo's development division. And while Nintendo threw more and more at it, Final Fantasy VII, the game Square had wanted to make on Nintendo hardware, became one of the defining events of the generation on PlayStation. By the time Ocarina arrived, it had to make the entire weight and Nintendo's entire strategy look justified. It worked. Famitsu had never given a game a perfect score, but Ocarina of Time became the first. In fact, it became the highest rated game that had ever existed, a title it would hold for years. Nintendo could make the greatest game in the world, and that still wasn't enough to win a generation. When GoldenEye arrived, PlayStation had shipped 20 million consoles. By the time Ocarina landed, it was past 40 million. By the time the generation was over, the Nintendo 64 had sold just under 33 million consoles. The PlayStation sold more than 100 million. That literally sounds insane when you think about what Nintendo was putting out. I'm sure a lot of you could fill the comments with memories of Diddy Kong Racing, or the first time you played GoldenEye with friends, or the moment you first took control of Mario in Mario 64. But making the greatest games was only ever half the job. Nintendo had spent decades believing developers needed it more than it needed them. It decided what they could release, what their games could contain, and how much they would pay for the privilege. Nintendo's games, while incredible, weren't the only things that mattered. Everyone else needed room for their ideas to grow and their creations to flourish. Nintendo's rules made that increasingly difficult. Then Sony entered the market and gave developers that opportunity. Namco brought Tekken, Capcom brought Resident Evil, and Square brought FF7. Every developer filled another space on the shelf. Another reason to own a PlayStation while Nintendo was still working on its next masterpiece. And sure, Nintendo's games could still dominate the moment they arrived.
Want to see something really cool? Check this out!
Mario 64 proved that. Then Mario Kart proved it again. So did GoldenEye. And finally, Ocarina of Time did it better than any game ever had. Every one of those games gave Nintendo the same reassurance that the next masterpiece could carry the console until the one after it was ready. So Nintendo kept building monuments, and Sony kept giving everyone else somewhere to belong. Before you ever pressed start in Mario 64, Nintendo let you grab Mario by the face. It was a promise that this machine could do something you had never seen before. And every time another masterpiece arrived, that promise felt true again. Mario 64 was one of the greatest games ever made.
Let's go!
And Nintendo spent the rest of the generation believing greatness could solve everything else.